Hey Blockheads, this is DM Mitch.
And this is DM Neal.
We want to take a moment to thank all of you who support this and all other Block Party Podcast Network shows through Patreon.
Yes, thank you so much for your support.
We also wanted to take a second to tell you about our next stretch goal.
That's right. When we reach $400 of monthly support, we will begin a new podcast called the DM Book Club.
The DM Book Club will be a monthly released podcast where we have an in-depth discussion on official and unofficial RPG materials, and even some novels.
The DM Book Club will have guests just like the Dungeon Master's Block. Every book that we look at, we will discuss from the viewpoint of, you guessed it, the DM.
Books will be voted on by Patreon members, so if you want to see this goal become a reality, you can help by heading over to www.patreon.com/blockpartypodcastnetwork.
Again, thanks for listening and supporting us, and now enjoy the episode.
Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all their people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, Dungeon Master Mitch.
And I'm DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And today we have two members of the Block Party Podcast Network. We have Matt and Josh from Detentions Dragons joining us for, yes, a creation and inspiration 2-part episode. So this part, we will be talking about architecture in the real world and how it can inspire you for your homebrew worlds. And then, of course, that means next episode, Neal, you, me, Josh, and Matt will be sitting down and we will be giving our top 5. So you got to stay tuned for that.
Yes, it was quite possibly too much fun.
Now, the sad news, Neal, is that you will actually, even though you're hosting this episode, not be a part of the first part discussion because you were not able to make it. You had some work stuff going on.
It's true.
Super sad, but you will be there for part 2. But you're here for us now, Neal, so can you start us off with a 5-star review?
Yes, so this first review is entitled Great Viewpoint, 5 stars, by BM Calpine. Great podcast. I have only listened to a few podcasts, but I am just getting back into role-playing games after a 25-year absence. Well, first off, welcome back. I look forward to potentially expanding back into a GM role, and this show is giving me some great ideas. So, yes, you will probably get frustrated if you haven't already at the number of ideas we have given to you, but hopefully you are already using some. So thank you, BM Calpine.
And hopefully that's a good frustration. Our next one comes from Natoroar, and it is entitled The Dungeon Master's Block Miracle, 5 stars. Listen, children, and listen well. Oh man, this is a good one. For the tale of the 5-star review you must hear. A night just like tonight. In 100 episodes long ago, 2 GMs by the name of Chris and Mitch went searching for a place to broadcast their wisdom. They went to major podcast networks, but there was no room for them in the lineups. Not canon, but okay. So they found a small studio, my apartment, and gave birth to their beautiful baby podcast. Other GMs came bearing gifts of commentary, ideas, and advice. All the while, the shepherds of GMnastics were greeted by a host of heavenly fans. Behold, a new podcast is born. Glory to podcasts in the highest caliber and good stories to human rogues and dwarves. Oh man, this is amazing. And this is why we celebrate their 100th episode with a 5-star reviews, because it's such a good podcast. It's almost biblical. That is amazing. And that was written around Christmas time. We missed this review, so
yep.
Natoroar, sorry for missing this amazing review, but we get to read it now.
All right. I don't know how we can live up to that, but we're going to try. So for our third review, it is from Veranor, and they entitled it Essential and Inspiring. Thank you guys so much for existing. I just want to stop there. I feel like that'd be amazing if that was the whole review. It's not though. I listen to you at work, and it really keeps my mind buzzing with new possibilities while driving off the work night slog. I've been through each episode multiple times now and still find new inspiration each time. So thank you, Veranor, for listening more than once. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, give us some notes, because we forget about them.
And with that, Neal, you know what time it is.
Let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The plate meat's back on the menu, boys.
For the meat this week, we are doing our creation and inspiration 2-part series. We're super excited. I know all of you listeners love these episodes, especially when we do our top 10s or top 5s. And today I have 2 guests joining me, both from a show here on the Block Party Podcast Network, Joshua Rysted and Matthew Keel, hosts of Detentions and Dragons. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, of course. Josh, how are you feeling today?
Feeling good. Thanks for having us on, Mitch.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the first Block Party podcast show that you've been on. I mean, your show now, we're excited to say, is part of our network, but you also were on Geek Wars. So if you listen to this episode, listeners, and you're like, I can't get enough of Josh and Matt, go over and listen to Geek Wars as well. But yeah, I'm excited to finally get you on the Dungeon Masters Block.
Well, I mean, we totally destroyed Geek Wars, so it's time that we brought our intellectual prowess
No spoilers.
No. Well, let's just say it's an interesting experience.
It is an interesting experience. Definitely a lot of fun. Interesting topics. I think Matt and I we did pretty good there, Matt.
Yeah, but we're not here to talk about Geek Wars. We're here to talk about, what are we talking about?
Dungeons and Dragons, right?
That's correct.
Hey, so we start off by, can each of you kind of tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves, whatever you want to tell them.
Sure. Josh, go for it. Give it a start.
Sounds like a plan. Well, I am a 5th grade science and social studies teacher out in Minnesota. Big Star Trek nerd, huge D&D nerd, run a lot of D&D games throughout the community. I also work at a comic book shop on the weekends, so I mean, plenty of outlet there. But yeah, no, just a big old nerd all the way around.
And I'm Matt Keel, and I'm also a high school teacher, not a elementary or middle school teacher, and also been a fan of video games and RPGs for a good portion of my life. And then about a few years ago, I had a student come up to me and say, hey, can we have a Dungeons and Dragons club at school? And because I say basically no to no one, especially kids at school, I'm like, sure. And I didn't really know how to play. And then I realized, they didn't know how to play or DM. So I listened to a bunch of podcasts, started DMing. And then with Josh, we were just talking one day because we were playing in our own game then at that point. And we were like, hey, I think I said something to the effect of, do you want to start a podcast? And he's like, yes, I want to do this podcast, Detentions Dragons, which is all about introducing Dungeons and Dragons at school. And I'm like, well, let's do it. So we did that about a year ago, and we've been doing it since.
Almost near our 50th episode.
Fantastic. Yeah, and so you guys are both 2 teachers doing this podcast, Detentions and Dragons. You're relaying stories and information and ideas and inspiration about running D&D in a school setting. Although your podcast, I think a lot of your listeners would also say, is just good for DMs all around and D&D players all around, whether they're in that school setting or not. So currently, as we're recording, it's August, it's summertime. So what, during the summertime, you guys just don't make podcasts because you're not in school? What have you been up to lately with the podcast?
Well, we did take a little bit of kind of a deviation from our standard type of episode release. We're still releasing essentially weekly, but during the school year, we tend to focus on episodes that are focused for they're especially helpful for teachers who are trying to run D&D in school. We also do things that are more accessible to just general DMs, like general DM tips, explaining how to do these or implement certain rules within your game, homebrew ideas, those types of things like that. So over the summer, we just had some fun episodes where we talked about some homebrewed items. We talked about running a D&D summer camp. We had a couple people on for different interviews. We had Kurt Bolin from Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, so we talked to him about running D&D with kids. We talked to Wolfgang Bauer from Kobold Press about what he's doing there. So yeah, we've just kind of been doing some episodes that are themed with Dungeons and Dragons, but in August, we're going to basically start our back to school blitz. So we're going to go leaning heavy into preparing for clubs and classroom experiences, though I think other DMs can pull some valuable information from that as well too.
Indeed.
Yeah, you guys have definitely kept busy even while school has been on hiatus, which is fantastic. Yeah, listeners, if you haven't checked out Detentions and Dragons, whether you're a teacher or a student or you're none of those things, I just want to say there's a reason we brought them and asked them to come into our network. It's because we think they're fantastic. So go check these guys out. Go listen to their show. You can get all sorts of inspiration from them. Before we wrap up our interview segment, I want to ask you guys a surprise question from one of our Patreon dragons. This one comes from Gallican, a silver dragon, and he asks, have you ever pilfered systems or ideas from other games and use them in D&D to enhance your campaign? If so, what was it? And you guys can take as much time that you want to think about it, or just answer right away.
Yeah, we actually have I think it's episode 4, is that right, Matt? Stealing and Dragons, where we talk about pilfering, borrowing ideas, mechanics, system NPC ideas from other places, other modules, groups, sometimes even other podcasts. Oh no. Yeah, no, I do quite a bit. Even with my summer campaign and my school campaign, we have a school shop, and even just the name Gnome Depot and the mechanic behind how kids can buy stuff, that came from another podcast. I can't totally take credit for it.
Hold on, you took Gnome Depot from a different podcast? Josh, you have been... You have been...
No, Matt's world is...
Oh my gosh.
Worldview is crushed right now.
You have always acted so proud of Gnome Depot. I thought that was a joke you made up.
No,
I'm done. Get me off this podcast.
I told you
I'm
about
done. Closing the microphone. Unplugging.
Oh, Matt just signed off.
Look, Abercrombie and Witch was my creation.
Okay, you redeemed yourself.
So there we go.
So I think that... So for... inspiration, definitely taking ideas from many different sources. Lots of different podcasts. I know that I've taken ideas from Sneak Attack and The Adventure Zone because those have some really good character scenarios. In terms of game mechanics, I probably stole some things from maybe 3.5 or Pathfinder, because sometimes when you play 5th edition, it's so streamlined and it's so good, but sometimes your players want something just a little bit more detailed. So if you want some of those rules that kind of expand on, well, how would you have psionics? I don't think psionics is a big part of 5th edition yet, but I know that other editions have more ruling on how psionics works. So I would let a student add in some psionics to his character, and we kind of had to manipulate it and homebrew it to fit in the 5th edition type of framework.
Yeah, and I think 5th edition is so streamlined, which I think is a wonderful thing in almost every aspect. But sometimes you as a DM run into a scenario where how there aren't rules on this. How would I run this situation? And if you're familiar with, like you said, Matt, Pathfinder or 3.5 or whatever edition or other game rules, being able to go, you know what, let me, whether you take it completely or take it partially and go, I'm going to use this a little bit. I'm going to use this to fit into this situation right now that I'm currently facing.
Yeah, totally agree.
So thank you so much, Gallican, for that question, and thank you, Matt and Josh, for those answers. Let's jump into part 1 of this Creation Inspiration episodes. We're going to be talking about architecture, real-world architecture, and how it can inspire us to bring the cities, the towns, the architecture, the statues, monuments, all of that to life when we are DMing games in our own homebrew worlds. So, to begin with, how is it that real-world architecture can inspire you developing your homebrew worlds and cities? Has this been something that has seeped into your guys' DMing styles? Is this something that gets into the way that you describe and you pull from inspiration from real-world architecture into your own homebrew worlds?
Oh yeah, totally. I'm a very visual person. I have like a file on my computer just with pictures that I pull. Some of them like just fantasy art based, some of them actual real life, photographs of pictures of places. And I use that quite often just to even get inspiration for how do I describe this graveyard, or how do I describe this palatial palace on the side of a mountain, I find that pulling from photos, just you're able to describe it a bit more, to the players. And I try to, whenever I DM, I try to use like a rule of 3, where I at least have to describe 3 senses. So beyond just what you see, it could be what you see, what you hear, what you smell or taste, or is it a dockside? Can you taste the salt and smell the rotting seaweed? Things like that. I find, that is a big help when I'm designing worlds.
Dear Mitch, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not that clever of a person. And who am I to say that my ideas are better than the collective vision of thousands and thousands of years of human civilization? So for me to reinvent a civilization is not only going to be probably kind of difficult, but also maybe a little underwhelming when there is so many rich cultural sites that you can take inspiration from, so many pieces of architecture that can just, capture exactly what you were thinking even before you realized what you wanted. So yeah, real world architecture, whether it is from modern to ancient, totally serves as an influence in my campaigns.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have so much inspiration from thousands of years, like you said, but also worldwide, all the different cultures. You can go to one culture, one area of the world, and look through their history of architecture and have your mind just overflowing with different ideas. But then you can go to another area of the world and get even more so. And it really is almost an endless well that you can just dive into and pull inspiration from all these different cultures throughout time and the way that they created buildings, and looking at the materials they used and realizing that a lot of the times it comes down to materials that were available to them. And that's why their certain architecture looks the way that it does. Also realizing that their architecture is based off of the environments they're in, the weather. They needed to create certain things to protect them from the elements. And all of these things, the more that you can dive into just looking at the architecture and researching different types of architecture, you're learning more, you're being inspired more in your own real world to go, oh man, so I've set up this culture, this people in this land. What does their architecture look like? Where can I draw from in the real world? Look at that and be like, yeah, it would look somewhat like this. I can change it around a little, but man, this is a fantastic picture of what I want to paint for my players, of what the buildings, the structures that these people live in.
And I believe you mentioned it, Mitch. Not only that, but also what systems do they have in place? What's their transportation like? What are their market squares like? What resources might they have available? One of my favorite places to draw from is Amsterdam, with the canals and the boatways and the bridges and the houses that are built so close to each other. Like you have to build large windows and put a support beam out front so that when you do move large furniture, you hoist it up through the window because the stairs are so small. Just that little mechanic, of what the interior of the house must be like, just because of the environment around. It affects the architecture. It paints a richer picture for your players.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, it's what is going on in the culture around this, wherever it is, this land is going to affect it. Not like just weather, but you look at Roman architecture and you look at these huge Colosseums. What does that say about the culture that was around back then and the way that they viewed violence and games and sporting events? It was very prominent and important to them, which is why you have these massive structures to hold massive amounts of people. If you go to a land where there would be no real interest in games and sports, where you had a peaceful society that wouldn't have engaged in gladiator fights and such, there would be no such Colosseums. At least they wouldn't be used for those purposes.
You'd probably have like amphitheaters and something to hold these classes or debates or something like that. Maybe that could even get worked into the law system, that we don't fight, we argue to the death.
Argue to the death. That sounds scary.
I've been in a couple of those debates. At least it felt that way.
So what are, when we talk about different real world architectures and different cultures surrounding that, what are some of your favorites that you've looked at and it's like, man, this really gets my inspirational juices just flowing?
Matt, you want to take this first?
Yeah, sure. I could start off with one. Now, I've been to at least 2 different countries in my life. That's right. The United States and Japan. I was a teacher in Japan for a couple of years. I've been to some other countries as well, too. But one of the places that was so awe-inspiring for me was a place in Kyoto. It's called Kiyo Mizudera. And Kiyo Mizudera is essentially it's a huge temple. And everything about the whole experience is just really fantastic. From the part where you're sort of at the base of this hill and you have to walk up this like long winding street, and it's up a hill, and it's probably a good, I might be misremembering this, about almost like a mile, and you're just walking up this winding road, and all along the way there are all these different like little shops and vendors, and in the modern day they're kind of like more like gift shops and shops that are selling like foods and snacks like that, but it just feels so atmospheric, like you're going through this just narrow small town and you're making your way up to this arguably one of the most fantastic temples that you'll see in Japan, or possibly the world. It is a temple that is completely made of wood. It's built into the side of the hill. There is this like huge veranda, it's like a huge porch type thing that is hundreds of feet long, and it like you can view the city of Kyoto from this, and like the temple is surrounded by trees. And one of the really cool things about this is there's just like so much to take away from. Either the kind of reference of the whole thing to this like special fountain that they have, and there's like these 3 spouts, and there's like a lore behind it where if you drink water from one of these different streams that's coming out of this fountain, it will grant your wish. But like one is like a wish for wealth, a wish for health, or a wish for love. So it's like you have to choose which one you drink from, but you can drink from all 3 of them. So the whole experience and seeing this just can provide so much atmosphere for like one of my D&D campaigns.
Japanese architecture I find so gorgeous when it's centered around nature that's around it. Like you have, like you're talking about a temple, and I'm just imagining in my head that beautiful temple building with those curved roofs and a bridge leading across a pond filled with just beautiful thousands of them goldfish. It's when it centers itself around the nature and the way that they build these structures. It's amazing and it's beautiful, and it says a lot about the culture that's building these structures.
Yeah, totally. So if you're looking for some inspiration for like just a really cool looking temple, Kiyomizu-dera, located in Kyoto, it's probably like one of the best temples you'll ever see.
Very cool. No, I guess mine, I pull a lot. When I was back in college, I took a trip over to Europe. We hit the Netherlands and Amsterdam, or Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Then we went through Belgium, and then we ended up in Paris. And just the architecture there, I use for a lot of my city planning, my cityscapes. Like, and especially in Amsterdam, like you have the canals, people still travel by boat, move stuff through, because the roads are extremely narrow. A lot of it is cobblestone and brickwork, and the water table there is really low. So you've got, the trees are green in the summertime because you have moss and stuff growing, and everything is just got the slight damp to it. The buildings are just gorgeous. They're closely packed together. They remind you of a medieval town still to this day. But just even the flow of it, the hustle and bustle, even though it's a busy, industrial city in a way, there's still spots to relax. There are cafes that just like they open up these glass walls and you just sit out and you can enjoy yourself in the afternoon. And between that and the palace that they have there are spots in the palace that you walk out into this huge kind of throne room, and you have this stone and metal inlaid globe map, in the ground, just inlaid, and you walk on it, and it's gorgeous. You look up into the dome ceiling, and there's this painted constellation, kind of Fresno, I think is what it's called, and it's awe-inspiring. And whenever I design like a palace, I pull directly from that. Just a lot of windows, a lot of glass, light comes in. It's just great.
I think one thing that you guys are pointing out that's such a real important part to being inspired by different types of architecture is you've both pointed out places that you've gone and you've seen these places. And I mean, travel's expensive. Not everybody has the luxury of being able to travel the world all the time. But when you can go to different places with different cultures and architectures and actually see this firsthand, I think it's so amazing to be able to gain inspiration from and to learn from. I mean, this is something that you hear like game designers do all the time, is if they want to really work hard to make the style of the environments in their games real to them. I mean, Skyrim, the creators of Skyrim went to the places that they were basing Skyrim off of to gain that inspiration. And I think it's incredibly powerful to see it firsthand. I know when I was able to take a trip in the summer of one of my college years to Jordan and Israel, seeing Petra up close was one of the most amazing sights. And to be able to take those structures built into these stone walls, you bring that into your gaming, you bring that into your DMing, and you can really try to now, since you've seen it, paint that picture to your players of these structures based off of these cultures you've seen, and bring that into your game. Put that into real homebrew world cultures.
Yeah,
Does anybody else do this where you go to a place, even if it's a modern area, and you see something unique, or you see a structure or a house or a building, and you design a character that might be living there or standing there or, interact with that place? I mean, because I that's something I do. And maybe it just might be my overactive imagination and things like that. But the wife and I recently took a trip out to Grand Marais on the north shore of Lake Superior here. And a lot of forest area, a lot of, it's right on the lake. So you kind of got that freshwater sea feeling. But there's a lot of little cabins and nooks. And as we were driving along and kind of walking some of the trails, I was like, I wonder, that's a really good kind of mountain dwarf, like ranger outpost, or I could see, a party of elves kind of crowd. I kind of draw, as you said, you go there, you draw from the environment, and you kind of feel it a little bit more. And from that, you can kind of give that feeling to your player characters when you describe it. So, but is it just me? Anybody else do that in their spare time?
Oh yeah, totally, Josh, all the time. I just went to Target and I was like, what type of, you know what? It's going to be a warlock. They pledged to their patron, which was just that Target dog, and now they get the ability to give 10%
15%
discounts.
off.
10%.
Yep.
They don't give 50% discounts at Target. What are you talking about?
Listen, if you're pledging to a warlock, you're getting 15, man. I mean, that's just bad negotiating
I pledged
skills
myself to Target for 1 year making tiny pizzas.
You worked in the food court.
Yeah, in the food court. And what did I get? I got 10% off, and sometimes I ate a tiny pizza that I had to pay for with 10% off.
Well, you should have been a warlock.
I totally get what you're saying. I think that I often say that before I even knew what Dungeons and Dragons was, in a way, I was, even from a young age, playing Dungeons and Dragons. Because when it comes down to it, D&D is a game of pretend. It's a game of imagination. And when I was running around my backyard with my brothers and we were playing games we made up, like Monster Slayer, where like one of us was the monster that had to be defeated, I look back and I go, I didn't know what Dungeons and Dragons was then, but I was playing Dungeons and Dragons. I was doing this. And so I get what you're saying, because to this day, with the mindset that I have, that like I'm always like, I think about Dungeons and Dragons too much, probably. Like, you can go to these places, and I don't know if I have had a moment where it was so well thought out like you, but I definitely have, because it sounds like you have a structure to it. I'm not a very structured person sometimes, but I can remember being in Petra. I heard our guide say one word about the djinn and how they worship djinns, and I was like, immediately I'm just imagining like djinn and different, like all that magical D&D stuff that I've learned, and just it became this overflow of fantasy lore inspiration in that moment. And then he continued talking, and it had nothing to do with djinn, and I don't remember what he talked about after that because my mind was already gone.
You kind of became the storytime Bob Ross, like, beautiful
Yes.
structure, and we're gonna put a little djinn here. Here's a floor trap. Here's a spike trap. Ooh, that'd be a really good place for something to pop out and go boo. If maybe a perception check. Yeah, no, I know that feeling.
I think even if you can't travel to these places, though, I think being able to use the tool of the internet to look at all the tons and tons of images out there, you can literally spend hours searching different types of architecture throughout the world, whether it's Egyptian, Sumerian, early Irish, you could go on and on. I mean, Byzantine architecture is beautiful. These dome-shaped roofs with these huge spires of towers, some of them with these beautiful wrapping around staircases on the outside. You really only need to do a simple Google search to be able to see just tons and tons of beautiful buildings and start to pull ideas on the type of architecture that you could fill your homebrew world with.
Completely agree.
So I will elaborate on that a little bit. I was trying to think of some ideas for this episode, and I asked my girlfriend, whoop, like, what are some inspirational places that you've been to? And she's like, oh, you should look up Chichen Itza, which is in Mexico. And like this place, if you need inspiration for a D&D campaign, like this is it. There are so many structures in this Maya city. It's amazing. Like you have this big step pyramid called El Castillo, which was clearly named by some European explorers that came afterwards. But like within El Castillo, you have this temple that is dedicated to a serpent god, and there are carved railings that have serpents with feathers on them. You have one temple that's just called Temple of Skulls because it's essentially like a low platform. And like in the platform, there are these gruesome pictures of carved skulls. There's a picture of an eagle eating a human heart. And apparently, people at that time, they were like the explorers at that time, they were able to record some records. And there were sacrificial victims that their heads were displayed on this platform in this location. And I mean, they have all of these just super, super inspiring things. I was learning about this type of game that they played. I don't know all the rules, but I do know one thing, which was that the team that lost, their leader would be executed, and then his skull would be used as the core for the next ball that they would play with, which is like, I've never been there, but from 30 minutes of just a Google search, I could write a year-long campaign just with the types of things that, like, I learned about.
Can you imagine that locker room conversation? Okay, guys, who wants to be the next team captain? Any takers? Any takers?
Come
Tom,
on,
how about
guys.
you? Paul, I see you shrinking back there. You're hiding behind the locker. You're up next on the roster.
Yeah, and you know, man, I looked as you were talking, I looked this place up, and yeah, you can just look at these images and you gain so much inspiration. And I think one of the things that I think is really cool about checking out different places, different beautiful works of architecture around the world is going, okay, I've got this inspiration staring me down now. How do I take this and how do I make this something that's my own in my homebrew world? And I think you can do a number of things. You can mix and match. You can take two different types of architecture and you can kind of work them together into something that's your own in your homebrew world. You can go back to stuff that we mentioned before about like, what are the materials that are available? I mean, what if you take this temple in Mexico and you have these images and you say, but what if they used a different material to make it? Same architecture style, but it has a different coloring, it has a different texture because the stone that this area has is different. You can just take all different things like that and add them in to give them a different type of look. You talked about the statues and the paintings on the wall. What is the culture that lives in this architecture going to make statues and monuments and paintings of in these buildings? It gives it a whole different feel while still pulling on real world architecture.
And I think as storytellers, because Dungeons & Dragons is a game of collaborative storytelling, one thing that we often promote to like our students and to other people is, all right, the more you read, the bigger your vocabulary is going to be. And I also feel that like when you look at architecture and you study these different places, you're essentially increasing your architecture vocabulary so that you can take those different elements and you can kind of assemble them into your own homebrewed world.
And not only that, being that Matt and I are teachers, and granted we're teaching on science and for myself social studies, oftentimes we are working with kids to look at critical thinking, making inferences. And if all of a sudden you created a world that was similar to maybe a culture that had been talked about or studied, but you changed things up quite a bit, all of a sudden you got kids like, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. I know something. I think this is kind of something that maybe Mrs. Johnson had talked about when we talked about the Incas or the Spartans of ancient Greece. Making those connections and those inferences is not only enlightening but also empowering to not only students but players.
And everything we're talking about, none of this is new, right? Like, this is what us, like, especially if we're talking in the sense of like fantasy authors and world creators, like, this is something that's done all the time. I mean, look at like Magic the Gathering, and look at a plane like Theros, and the clear real world architecture and lore that's pulled in to create that setting. Look at Ravnica, and it's clearly drawing on like those castles and stuff, Gothic architecture. It's something that is done all the time in fantasy world creating. And so if this is something that you maybe haven't done a lot of, I think travel, internet, go watch some documentaries on architecture and different cultures in their architecture. Go read books like Josh and Matt were saying. Like, these are all different things that are going to help you really get a grasp, an idea of different types of buildings and monuments that can exist in your homebrew world to really make it feel like a world, a big world with different cultures.
Yes, 100% agree.
Indeed.
So we've talked about a lot of the inspiration aspect of this and different types. I mean, we could go on and on and on about different types of architecture and cultures in the world, but I think our time is better served saying, hey, go look up some lists, go do your own research, because we can't on this podcast. It's not a visual media, so we're not going to be able to show you the images. So it's better if you're able to go and check those out. But we are now talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and you're sitting at a table and you are telling stories to your players, with your players. How do you take all this inspiration that we've just talked about, and how do you paint that picture in your player's mind when you're trying to you've got that image in your head because you've looked this all up? What are some tricks and tips that you can use to bring this architecture of these cultures that you have in your world to life to your players?
One thing that I tend to do, and I mentioned it a little earlier, I try to do what I call the rule of three, where I'll take the five senses, and one will always be sight, unless there's some condition preventing that. But generally, when they enter a place or they enter a town or a new setting, I will take a moment and just be like, okay, here's what you experience. And I'll say, I'll pick like sight, smell, taste, or sound. This is what it sounds like. Or maybe I'll extend beyond that and I'll tell them all five senses. But I usually try to do, three of them and try to paint this picture, including like, you're in a marketplace. It is busy. The noise is almost deafening as you hear people call out, cabbages for sale. We've got wonderful cabbages, freshly picked, and I'll throw in a few voices here and there, but like also the smells. You walk past a market stall and like the smell of these whatever spices are burning your nose, and the ground is made out of cobblestone. You try to put as much detail that the player can imagine experiencing in there. And I think that, it's one thing to do that versus say, you enter a market town. There are shops, there's a fountain, it's market day. It pulls the player deeper into that narrative and allows them to experience it. And when they experience it, I've often found they're more invested in the story, and they will get into character, and they'll play a different way than versus just, you're in a market. Matt, any insight there?
Yeah, I have a few tips. So these are some of the things that I think, and I think Josh, using that rule of three is a really, really great idea. My first tip, I would say, is don't reveal too much information. You've sat down, you've researched, you're using your own travels as inspiration, and there's this this drive to be like, all right, I'm going to give you all of the information about every piece of architecture right at the beginning. And what you've done is you've just essentially done like this text dump of all of the details. But when you think about how you learned about something or explored something, you explored it in details. You first walked up that trail and you smelled the different, breads that were cooking, and you felt the rain falling on your face. And then you get to the top and then more details are revealed. So number one, don't overload with too many details because you want to, but don't. Second, reveal details to the surrounding as it becomes relevant. So it's this idea of exploration, which I think is very, very important. And then third, what I would also point out is that sometimes you can convey things about a place without necessarily stating that direct thing. So if you're saying this place it's really hot outside, you could talk about how the plaster walls are cracking from the heat, or you could talk about the city is surrounded with people sweating in the shadows of canopies or something. So instead of saying, oh yeah, it was really hot outside, you can describe in detail about the surrounding with the people or the things that interact within that surrounding.
I think that's fantastic advice. Like, rather than just a huge information dump, when you're on the bridge, when you're crossing the bridge, describe the bridge. When you're at the temple, describe the temple. When you're doing a rooftop chase, have a little bit of detail thrown in about the type of rooftop that you're on. Like, when it comes and it is prevalent to what's happening, that's when you can give details and start to really paint that picture of the architecture that you are focusing on at the time. When your PC decides to knock down the pillar of the temple, you can describe that pillar. If it's wooden, maybe it's kind of easy. If it's marble, maybe a little bit harder.
Totally. And again, that just really emphasizes the way that really good stories play out, is these details that are revealed over time.
And I think there are different aspects of the architecture that your players are going to naturally ask more details about.
Oh, totally.
Almost every time I bring up that there's a statue in the room, my players want to know what the statue looks like.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's mostly because they're hoping there's gems in the eyes, or they're worried that statue might come to life and fight them, but they always want to know details. They always want to know who is this statue of? Is there an engraved name on it? Is there information? Is there information plaque? What does it look like? Is it holding a weapon? They start to ask questions, especially when either one, they think that it's important, or you just make some sort of statement about that leads them to believe this is an important piece that we're looking at.
Yeah, and it's cool when players can discover those things on their own, even if you are the person elaborating those details of those discoveries.
And sometimes with the description, this can lead to other story hooks or other story plots, or just even funny NPC interactions that players will like and enjoy.
I think also it's important here to just mention visually, go ahead, use visual aspects, pull out those pictures. If you're I want my building to look just like this real world architecture, then show everybody a picture. Get their mind understanding what type of architecture that they're looking at. If you have the ability to, it's fantastic if you're using maps and minis and stuff. You can go on Amazon and find cardboard models of different types of buildings. If you want to spend a little extra money to drop a Gothic cardboard church down on your map to really get it in your player's mind, this is the building you're working around, do it. There are little things that you can do to really just say, hey, I don't even need to describe this because I can just show you and get your mind going with what the architecture is that you are surrounded by.
Agreed.
One of the things that I've been doing with a game that I've run at the Gamers Den here is we have a Facebook group, and I will post photos of pictures that inspire me to kind of help players imagine this along with me. And that also allows for a bit of a running commentary, even during the time that we're not playing.
Yeah.
So technology is helpful in this case.
Yeah, and speaking of that, and I think this might be more for very specific people with certain talents, but if you have the talent of art and you're able to paint or draw, like if you're able to like draw a picture of this building that you find important to your campaign, do it and show your players. That's fantastic. If you have Photoshop skills and you're like, I want to take a pyramid from Egypt, but I want it to be made out of blue marble, Photoshop that sucker. Like you can use skills that you have to make visual guides to show this is what you're looking at right now.
100% agree.
Well, that concludes our discussion on different types of architectures and pulling inspiration in from the real world to your homebrew worlds. I want to thank both Josh and Matt for joining me and talking about this. Matt, Josh, if our listeners want to check out your podcast, if they want to get in touch with either of you and ask you questions about your favorite type of architectures or just D&D or anything, teaching, whatever, where can they find / reach you guys at?
Alrighty. Well, they can send us a message at detentionsanddragons@gmail.com. They can certainly send us a message through our Facebook page. Just search Detentions and Dragons. My Twitter handle is Professor Olaf. They can certainly contact me on Twitter. And Matt, yours is?
At Matt M. Keel, Kuehl.
There we go. So yeah, feel free to send us a message. We'd love to hear from them.
And just to reiterate, Detentions and Dragons sounds like a teachers-only podcast. It isn't. There's something for everybody. So if you're a little hesitant about getting into a teacher-centric podcast, I would say go listen to our episode, New Listeners and Dragons. It's a 12-minute episode that highlights what we think are the best episodes for different types of listeners. Give that a listen, then go listen to some of our other podcasts. You'll like it.
Indeed.
And if you're like me and you listen to the show and you enjoy it, I always say this on the Dungeon Masters block for our show, but if you like their show, do these guys a favor, go on iTunes, take 5 seconds of your time and give them a 5-star review, telling them how much you like it. It will help them to have a better, to get more listeners because they will be more viewed on iTunes. Definitely do that if you enjoy what you hear.
Yeah, help us with that algorithm. It's all about those stars.
Please. Please.
So tune in next time to hear Josh and Matt return for part 2 of our Creation Inspiration episode, where we are going to bring with Neal Powell. Yes, Neal Powell will be joining us for that part 2. Each of us will bring a top 5 adventure hook story ideas to the table. It's going to be the first time that each of us is hearing each other's, and it's going to be a fantastic time. Let's see if we have, with 4 people, any crossover, or it's going to be great. We're going to riff on each other's ideas. Make sure to join in for that.
It's going to be super.
It'll be awesome.
All right, we just want to thank Josh and Matt again for coming on to the episode. And of course, we want to send a huge thanks for joining the network. I mean, you came onto the episode, but you also came onto the network. You still have that new network smell. I don't know what that is, and hopefully you can wash it off. But I don't know where to go from here. All right, if you want to get in touch with us, you can always head on over and email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, if you liked this episode and any of the others that we have and you see fit, head on over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review so we can get in front of more people. And of course, read your review out loud.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. And you can like our Facebook page. Both of those places are great places to go if you want updates about the show. We have a Patreon member shout out of the week. And this week's Patreon member shout out goes to
Christopher Colden.
Thank you so much, Christopher.
Yes,
Holden.
thank you.
Get ready for this, Neal. Are you ready?
I am.
Golden dragon. So perfect. I wonder, did he go, I have to, because my name, it would rhyme and it would just be a great shout out. So Christopher, thank you so much for your support. We hope that you are enjoying all the rewards that are being given to you on our Patreon, and thank you for supporting our show.
Definitely. And as always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out other shows like Geek Wars, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and of course, like the guest today, Detentions and Dragons, and so many more. And that's it for this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we focus on the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the ego of all of the people at the table. I'm DM Neal. Good night and good luck.
and keep on dungeon mastering.
I wonder what happened.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Welcome back.
You back?
Are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. Did you dropped out for me.
And you dropped out for me.
Well, that's it. Oh no, that's your part.
Oh, and with that, we're gonna head out of the gym. What do we say? What do we normally say?
Goodbye.